Hello. I'm so sorry, I'm gonna have the giggles now. Hello and welcome to this online panel on a new deal for authors' rights in 21st century Europe. This roundtable, which comes to you online, is co-organized by FERA, the Federation of European Screen Directors, and the Lichter Film Fest Frankfurt International Congress. This panel should have been a part of the Congress Future German Film Forum Europe, but due to the developments of the pandemic and the related measures, the Congress had to be postponed to next year. It will now take place from May the 11th to the 13th, 2022. And our host would like to invite you all to come to the Congress in Frankfurt at that time. And to kick us off with this roundtable this morning, I will give the floor to Klemen Dvornik, FERA's chair of the board. Klemen, the floor is yours.
Yeah. Good morning to everybody. In this moody morning, we prepared something to discuss at this panel. The idea that we were trying to put forward is with the rise of global streamers in European production and distribution markets, audiovisual authors' contracts and licensing practices are evolving across the value chain. And this panel, we will attempt to tackle a little bit the ideas how we need to move forward to ensure artistic freedom, creative and industrial independence in Europe. Today's panelists are Cécile Despringre, SAA Society of Audiovisual Authors Executive Director. Hello, Cécile. Marc de Moulin, European Composer and Songwriter Alliance Secretary General. David Kavanagh, Federation of Screenwriters in Europe Executive Director. Ada Salomon, producer and European Film Academy Deputy Chairwoman.
Impression of the recent changes that we have seen, particularly in the audiovisual landscape. Klemen touched upon it, particularly the rise of global streaming platforms in the production and distribution markets, and how that impacted your respective constituency or your work, because we have different types of speakers today. We have people who represent a network and a community of people or organizations, and we have Ada, who represents film producers and is a film producer herself, so she's got a more concrete and specific view on things. Maybe we'll start with David, on the screenwriter side. I know you don't like to start, David, but it's on you. What's your general impression, and maybe what struck you the most in what you have observed over the last couple of years in terms of changes to screenwriters' rights?
Thank you, Pauline. We're in a situation, I guess, in some respects, of kind of maximum lack of clarity at the moment. We have the legislative changes that are happening in the European Union that have been delayed because of COVID, and we don't know quite exactly what the impact of them is going to be. We've got the dreaded pandemic, which appears to be a story with no ending, which is going to drag on and on and on until we are all driven completely insane. And we have the issue that you ask us to address, which is the streamers. So for me, and I guess for most speakers, when you arrive in a situation where you don't know what to say, the first thing that you do is you fall back on a PowerPoint presentation, which is what I'm going to try and do now, if I can.
I'm sure you can.
And
Perfect.
my thought is in a sense to try to go back to very first principles, if I can make this work. I don't know why it's not.
I think you just have to scroll down, yeah.
Yeah, and what I thought I might ask straight away is what is it that we're talking about in the very broadest sense here? What is the volume of production in the European Union? How many pieces of TV fiction and feature films do we actually make in Europe each year? These figures are from 2018 mostly, and come from the European Audiovisual Observatory. From screenwriters' perspective, an important issue about feature films is the number of feature film scripts that are in paid development. And I've made a very rough guess here. I'm prepared to discuss that if anybody wants to, but just looking at the volumes, it looks that in 2018, we wrote and directed and composed music for more than 25,000 individual pieces of work. From screenwriters' perspective, we are rarely credited on feature documentaries, but they're important for directors. And of course, not included in here at all is advertising, which is an important source of work for directors, I know. But roughly speaking, we're talking about 25,000 separate items in the production in Europe in 2018. From my point of view, those aren't 25 episodes, they're 25,000 writers' contracts, they're 25,000 pieces of work. Who do they go to? Who gets to write and direct these things? We know that we made calculations ourselves about the number of screenwriters and the number of directors in joint work that FERA and FSE did to try to make this calculation. And there's also very interesting new statistics from the European Audiovisual Observatory, which back those calculations up fairly precisely about the numbers of people. Who are they? Many of you would be familiar with these graphs. European writers and directors in 2016, which is when we did these statistics, earned 19,000 euros per annum writing or directing European films and television programs. We did a rather attractive tracking of the career of writers and directors, which demonstrated the glass ceiling for female writers and directors very dramatically. But more to the point, pointed out that those who manage to sustain a career as writers or directors do so in a very strange and very difficult way. There's also interesting new statistics as well, which we've got from the European Audiovisual Observatory, which add to this understanding of instability. In the 4 years between 2015 and 2018, 52% of credited writers were credited for only 1 year in those 4 years. In other words, they only had one piece of paid work in 4 years, 51% of credited writers. This may seem to you to be quite bizarre, but it's reflected exactly for directors. 45% of directors had one credit in 4 years. And this analysis is really interesting analysis done by the European Audiovisual Observatory, which trawled through all of the credits on audiovisual fiction and made the analysis on that basis. Now I have to work out how to stop sharing. What's the point of raising these, of putting out these issues? I guess I'm trying to establish a much broader context, and also to try to bring us back to what are the key issues that we should, as FSE and as FERA, be trying to address. For the future, post-COVID, post-streaming, whatever the future holds, the issues surely are, will we be able to sustain the volume of production? Will there be the same amount of work available to our members for the future? And if there is, what will the makeup of it be? How much of it will be feature film? How much of it will be soaps on television? How much of it will be television series? How much of it will be 90-minute TV films? Additionally, how will we be paid for that work? Will we continue to be paid as badly and as unstable and unmanageable a way as we currently are? Or can we improve the situation? And that, it seems to me, to be the kind of broad context that we really should be working within, that we should be looking to as a general principle when we come to trying to find solutions. For me, I think to some degree, we've got ourselves a little bit like rabbits in the headlights with streaming. The fact of the matter is that it's still the case that 61% of hours of television that were broadcast in 2018 were soaps, not series, not TV series, not streamers, not global work, but work made by local broadcasters. In soaps, it's very often private broadcasters rather than public service broadcasters. But there's a huge amount of work that we tend not to think about, that we tend not to pay attention to, which is work that directors are paid for, that writers are paid for, and work which huge amounts, huge numbers, like way beyond what you would expect of European Union citizens, watch on a regular basis and with fascination and satisfaction. In 2018, everything has changed since 2018, we know. In 2018, 119 TV series of between 3 and 8 episodes were made in Great Britain. 75 series were made in Germany. 71 series were made in France. And a relatively small percentage of those are co-production. The industry is large. If you look at the 20,000 episodes of television that we produce in the European Union and compare it to the United States, in the United States in 2018, there was 5,500 episodes of television for the entire 335 million population of the United States and the global audience that it then went to. We shouldn't, I think, exaggerate the impact of global streamers. They're extremely important. They are changing the way that we work. They're going to alter the future. We have serious problems about sustaining the feature film structure that we've got used to over the last number of years, and perhaps we'll discuss that as we go along. But we should hold on to the broader context, I think, as we discuss this as we go along. And one of the nice questions that you asked, Pauline, just running up to a conclusion of what I'm saying, one of the nice questions that you asked was to ask for a particular impression of one particular small thing. Writers and directors in all of this have found themselves with startlingly similar positions on most of the situations that we've addressed. But one of the things that I have found very interesting recently, which happened kind of by accident, is talking to writers who have been contracted by independent producers in Europe, who have in turn been contracted by Netflix, and talking to those writers about their experience of working on Netflix series. I started the conversation with them about their contracts. What are their contracts like? How does it work? Blah, blah, blah. But what became very clear very soon was a community of opinion among writers that they found the experience of working with the streamers as writers extremely satisfying, extremely positive. And they contrasted it with the negative experience they have working with public service broadcasters or private broadcasters in Europe. They found the development process fast, clean, efficient, working with development executives who knew what they were talking about, with a commitment to a show which was driven through very fast, produced and distributed. And they found the whole process extremely satisfying. And this was very interesting and surprising to me. And as an interesting and surprising and rather unusual thing, I thought I'd throw it out there as the end of my few remarks.
Thanks, David. That's you've painted a broad picture already, and I think on this particular last point, indeed, there are a lot of things that we can comment on. We've talked yesterday with our first panel of the very tense situation we find ourselves in terms of production at the moment, because the picture you're painting with these figures is indeed pre-COVID. And now we are in a slightly different moment in time where actually it seems like independent cinema is in Europe is struggling to find talent and crew available, because there is a situation of full employment in a number of big production countries, which is very challenging in terms of means, in terms of working conditions, and actually in terms of quality of what's going to come out of these very happily written scripts. Because if the process is not equally satisfying for the entire production process, then in the end, you don't find yourself necessarily with super satisfactory results. I don't know, Klemen, if you want to comment before we move to our next speakers. No, okay.
No,
well,
I thought that my thoughts were the same. That maybe this the situation changed with the pandemic, but the picture David painted is clear what is happening in the direction that our sector is moving. So yeah, maybe we should invite our panelists to comment on that and maybe add something.
That's right. I think logically we should move to you, Marc, and the composers community, because we've talked about directors and screenwriters, but indeed all these works that David listed also have film composers, and it's really the sort of how can you call this, the author's tripod of an audiovisual work? I don't know, it's a weird name, but you see my point. What did you observe from your constituency over the last couple of years, and what struck you the most, maybe?
Well, thanks a lot first to FERA and the Lichter Film Festival for the invitation. Just wanted to react, to David's presentation. I mean, the first thing is that we are very jealous that we don't have a European music observatory yet, because it provides very good figures. So I hope this can be solved in the future. But of course, we are an integral part for us of the audiovisual authors community. We share many of the things that David has said. What we had to do on our side is to undertake a survey with our members, showing very much the same level of unfair remuneration for our members, showing that 74% of our members could not live from their artistic profession. We did this survey in May 2020. And otherwise, of course, there are positive things about the growth of global streamers, which among the positive things, of course, is that there is now more and more the ability of European works to find an audience, beyond their national territories. There has been, of course, very important cases for Netflix, for example, but this poses challenges for the remuneration of authors, of course, because very often when those works find a big audience beyond their territory, it poses a series of challenges regarding the transparency, regarding also the ability to get the royalties from foreign territories with different copyright laws. And so what we did was to survey again our members, and we wrote a report on the effects of buyout contracts. So what are buyout contracts? It's a contract where basically you don't get any royalties in proportion with the success of your work. It's something that we've seen happening more and more for audiovisual composers. 66% of them have seen a growth of buyout contracts, and this is something that is quite worrying, because basically they are paid through a lump sum once and then do not get any more royalties from the exploitation, very often outside of the national territories. Maybe I'm gonna stop here.
Whichever way you prefer, that's fine. Okay. Well, I think that's a very important point. Of course, the issue of maybe a change of format in terms of the valuation of authors' rights in contracts is something that we all are very concerned about and very attentive about. This notion that buyout contracts might be spreading for you in the music community is quite shocking as a change of practice. For us, a little less of a change of practice, unfortunately. However, there is maybe a sort of a new approach to this in contracts, which might be quite challenging. But before we get to that, let's move to Cécile Despringre from SAA, which represents collecting societies. You have a pretty specific standpoint on all these issues representing your members, and same questions. What's your general impression of the last 2 years, and maybe what struck you the most?
Thank you, Pauline, and thank you to FERA for the invitation to this panel. I think it's really interesting to discuss all these issues after the panel you had yesterday on a more general perspective on the future of European film. Well, from the position I have as a director of a European Association for Collective Management Organization, I would say, and what I could observe during the last 2 or 3 years, for me, the disruption of streamers and COVID mainly emphasized the weaknesses of the status of audiovisual authors and the long-standing challenges they have been facing in terms of their rights and remuneration. I can detail this in 4 aspects because I think it's a combination of different weaknesses that make their position really difficult today. I think, as emphasized by Edith Sepp yesterday in your first panel, the crisis highlighted that many audiovisual authors do not live from their job as screenwriters and directors. Many of them have other activities like teaching, but also outside of their creative field. So I think this is a real problem. If you cannot sustain a career with your main job, you have been trained for, you have the skills, you have some experience. So it's a problem that the industry has to face by rethinking the economy of the production and to better take into account the role and the remuneration of the authors. The second aspect of this are the contractual practices. Audiovisual authors have difficulties in enforcing their authors' rights and valuing their economic rights, because in their individual contractual relationship with producers, their role starts too early in the production process to be able to assess the value of the rights they transfer to producers. So, as highlighted by Marc, many audiovisual authors transfer their economic rights to producers in their production contract in exchange for a lump sum payment, and many of them do not have any possibility with this contract to receive additional payment. That's what Marc called buyout contracts. I want to emphasize a third element in this picture. Collective rights management is underexploited for audiovisual authors in the audiovisual sector, and I'm quite well placed to say that. In most European countries, collective management organizations manage only the rights that are entrusted to them by law. So in many countries, it's retransmission right, because there is a European directive which provides for mandatory collective management, and you have private copying compensation also because there are laws who provide for that. But the voluntary collective management system that exists in the music sector, where authors mandate their collective management organization to represent them in negotiation with many users which use music, is not much developed. Only a few countries where author status is more respected, like France, Belgium, I would say, have this voluntary practice. But in many other countries, the basis of the intervention of collective management organization is the law. So the legal framework is really important to change this. And then last element I wanted to highlight is the fragmentation of the market and the difference in responses to the crisis depending on the member states. From my perspective, I felt that in France, in Germany, in Poland, public authorities design support to audiovisual authors in response to the COVID crisis in cooperation with their representative organization, and they put in place support, that financial support that helped them to continue during the crisis. But in many other countries, the authors fell through the cracks of the support mechanism. So these are 4 elements of the weaknesses of the status of audiovisual authors that streamers are exploiting when producing in Europe, and that's an additional challenge, I think, that really need to be addressed.
Thanks, Cécile. I mean, this is interesting. Of course, we've several of you now have mentioned the issue of the general stability of careers, remuneration for work, articulating with remuneration for rights. Indeed, you're talking about the different responses and the fragmentation of the market. That's definitely something that is challenging when you look at the European picture. When you speak specifically about collective rights management, and you mentioned the fact that it's underexploited for audiovisual authors, maybe compared to the music sector at large, there is one important point that we need to underline, is that in the music sector, authors are not on their own applying collective rights management. They also have their publishers doing it with them, which is not the case in the audiovisual sector. And the structure of the transfer of right being quite different, it might also explain the difference of implementation of collective rights management. Going to you, Ada, from a film producer's perspective, how did you live through the last couple of years? And you work specifically on film production, if I'm not mistaken. So from that, because there is a massive difference, isn't it, between the production of cinema films and the rest, or not so much?
No, I don't see it like this. I mean, I'm a producer, but I'm working on author-driven films mainly, and I cannot work without the authors. I don't exist without the authors. So I think that my problems are the author problems, and they were very nicely presented here. And I would add to everything that was said here a very interesting article in Le Monde like 2 or 3 days ago regarding a manifesto made by 150 filmmakers, younger filmmakers. It's called l'ubérisation de la majorité des cinéastes de fiction et des documentaires en marche.
Absolument.
And it speaks actually precisely about something that both David and Marc were touching. How do you live as an author out of the royalties, of the collective side rights, and what is covering, and how the fact that we are not collecting from the streamers is affecting the level of life and the wealth and the possibility of a decent life of an author of any kind. And also, I think it's very interesting. I mean, okay, the setup was presented here. I'm thinking more about solutions than because the rest was depicted, and I have nothing to add. The same situation is here. One more worry on top of what was presented is the worry that of how much place it is for non-English speaking territories, authors, how much place is for them in the new global setup of huge production, and how much they know to defeat their rights, face to the giants. So I think that the solution here comes again, as usual, from solidarity and unity on a European level, because otherwise we cannot fight this. We are too fragmented, too different, with different cultures, with different practices, to be able to negotiate the rights on a really solid basis and with some power behind us. And I think that the European Union, yes, it's doing efforts to get this collective rights, the recognition, the contribution of streamers to the local, to the national production, or to the national authors. But then there is, from the perspective of producer and of an independent producer, it comes also this freedom of creativity. Because it's very interesting to observe also that more and more the streamers will jump over the producer to get straight to the script writers and directors, but mainly script writers. They would love to have in their screenwriting rooms the best script writers. And everything is going very fast, indeed, as it was mentioned. Not like in a fiction film where you need the time to finance, writing and rewriting, development, and this and that. A series can be done even in less than a year, from the idea, the sketch Bible, and the delivery. So we cannot sustain this, but in the same time, we want to have products that are creative, that reflect the European culture, that reflect the national culture. And we have to fight for that, but we cannot do this alone. We are too small. Also, I think that it will be interesting to explore, and another solution is to look back in time to the moment when the international co-productions in feature films started. And how this, of course, in a completely different time frame, situation, setup, but I think would be interesting to learn from the past, which were the measures that lead to the construction of the co-production system and the active European co-production that gives strength to the European cinema, and how we can transfer this towards the audiovisual works in general, and where is it going, the co-production, into series, into products that are designed for the streaming, and what mechanism we can implement in this in order to ensure even more local content, I mean, more territories that are contributing to the nationality of a product, that makes it stronger, because then it travels in more territories. And this allows the access also for the authors to multiple territories deals. So that's my idea. I know that, for instance, Eurimage, the supporting fund of the Council of Europe, is developing at this very moment a scheme to help series co-production and to support as gap financing, the way they were doing with a cinema European or European and the extended sense of the Council of Europe collaboration in series and products that are meant for streaming. But that's the only initiative that I know on a global level. So that's my perspective, that we have to look what can we do, and of course exchange ideas and exchange achievements. So speaking out loud about every single achievement in a territory and see how we can implement it in our little territories. I know how we were building the whole things, the author rights law, and even the cinema law, the audiovisual instruments that we have in Romania. They were all inspired by the French laws, but adapted, of course, to the reality of Romania. But I think that this kind of exchange, and this also, it's coming from my experience during the pandemic. I had hundreds of hours of Zooming with colleagues from around Europe to see which are the best measures to secure our shootings, and get an idea from Denmark, and another one from Spain, and an interesting income from Holland, made us do measures in Romania that are easy to implement. We convinced the authorities not to restrict it too much and to be functional. I think that in this respect, in order to secure the existence, at the end of the day, to secure the I would dare to call it wealth of an author, in order to be able to create in decent conditions, we need to put our brains together and work together. That's my perspective.
It's you make a very interesting point about the fact that in this crisis situation, we have found European collaboration, even when it was by Zoom between people who knew each other randomly, very useful. And actually that it brought us ideas, and it became probably more concrete than it ever was when it was organized in a bit of an artificial way. When we needed it, we found a true use to it by ourselves very often, without any sort of support in doing so. So I find that to be sort of a bit of hope in the darkness. And you mentioned two things that I think we'll probably discuss a bit further in a moment. One has to do with the fact that in this, we have a little bit of two cultures of production clashing in this moment. And you're describing one reality where producers are basically put aside from the copyright value chain and positioned as executive producers instead of delegate producers, weakening their position in many ways. And then for those producers like you who are building in a slower way, more complex and more risky projects, you need to have a level of control of intellectual property to make that happen, and you need time. And as you say, then the question of the valuation of authors' rights on a sort of a long tail logic becomes an issue. And I think that's a little bit what our French colleagues put forth in that tribune in the French press. It was about how online exploitation does not generate the same level of authors' rights and royalties payment for creators, and that puts a real question mark to the time you can put in a work and the personal investment you put in development, just like a producer would. So these two things I think we'll touch to again. Ada, you go ahead.
Yeah, I would like to add one thing that I think it's very relevant in the whole chain of what we are discussing regarding the streamers. It's the non-transparency of the data. And actually, this is the clue of it, because you have no clue what your work was generating. Of course, you see that you are number 1 or number 8 of the week, but
who cares over time?
Yeah. While when we go back in time and we look of the reports that the broadcasters were doing, and how you can understand how much your work was seen or generated audience, it's a completely different thing. And the moment that I don't know how it can be forced and who can impose and or how can be imposed this the change into the attitude of the big players in terms of disclosing the.
Well, we have the law. We have the law, and we have a little bit of that, which I think we'll also discuss in a second, the transparency obligation. But these are, I mean, I think you've touched upon the three key themes to discuss a bit further. And with this first round, I'll let Klemen take over for the second one.
Yeah, you opened quite a few, all of you, ideas to discover. It's obvious that we are more or less going into the uncharted territory, that we didn't see these changes that are happening in the last 2 years are bringing us to new situations. So there are some ideas that were presented how we should go forward with this. So what do we need for the direction on the national levels, on the UE levels? What are the maybe legislations that are still to be implemented? What is this maybe to strengthen our positions for negotiation of our rights? To better our positions in retaining intellectual property. Maybe David, I challenge you to tackle this.
Yeah, challenge is the right word, Klemen. One of the things that I very much appreciated in the discussion yesterday, Costa Gavras and Edith Sepp in particular, was the emphasis on cultural diversity. And this is an issue that I'm not a young person anymore. I remember when this was something which was absolutely at the core of everything we discussed in European film in particular, and television to some degree, was the issue of cultural diversity. And somehow this has faded out of our discussions, out of our thinking, out of the way that we imagine going forward. And I think one of the problematic aspects of that is the emphasis on co-production. Co-production is problematic. It's culturally, artistically problematic. We used to talk about Euro puddings as a kind of a dismissal of the problems of co-production. So for myself, I find the emphasis on co-production a little bit concerning, especially as the vast majority of production in Europe is not co-produced. The vast majority of it is produced in national territory by national producers and national broadcasters. And I don't see why co-production is seen as necessarily leading to a solution. That's different from cooperation between people, of course, exchange of information and knowledge of one another and crossing borders and blah, blah, blah. I think another thing that's very important for us to hold on to in terms of these general principles, and excuse me, with all of these Zoom meetings, eventually, you know, your brain begins to froth a little bit and you become a little bit messianic, and you start to have big visionary dreams and so on.
Please do, David. That's what we need. It's Thursday morning. Go ahead.
Yeah, let me go for it. Less than 20% of European Union citizens go to church, go to any kind of religious behavior. A little bit under 66% of European citizens vote in elections. 1/3 of them don't vote. Can you imagine that there is one single European Union citizen anywhere, all 500 of them, who haven't been to the cinema? Every single European Union citizen has been to the cinema, not just once, but many, many times in their life. What about television? The average viewing of television is 3.5 hours a day, 7 days a week by European Union citizens. In the history of artistic production, there has never, ever been a situation where every single citizen has access to artistic production. It's not limited to the elite. It's not stuck only with those people who have wealth and can have access to art. Everybody has access to this. We have a tendency, I think, a little bit to see ourselves constantly as in a position of crisis. It's the precise reverse. What writers and directors and producers in Europe do is extraordinarily important. I live in a country where our moral compass has changed from when I was a young person. I was told that sex outside marriage was the mortal sin, and I would spend eternity in hell for considering such a thing, to a situation last week where the population of my country voted for divorce, gay marriage, and abortion within 3 years. How did we change our opinions within a generation? We changed our opinions because we found a source of new information. And that source of new information was largely film and television coming from outside Ireland. That's simply the case. I know I'm becoming a little bit crazy here, but we shouldn't underestimate in any way, sense, shape, or form how important we are. And in the context of that importance, in the context of that value to society, in the context of that glue that we create that holds our societies together, that creates the identity of our societies, the idea that we should be worried and concerned about not being paid sufficiently is an extraordinarily negative situation to be in. You know, we say we can solve it by a legislative change here, we can solve it by getting the streamers to pay there, we can solve it by buyout contracts. We have to think about important issues at the moment, like gender participation in our industry, like more diversity in our industry, like the green issues and sustainability issues. We have a long agenda, but at the core of that agenda, surely we can be more aggressive, more assertive, more demanding about the remuneration, about the lifestyle, about the capacity to live of the people that we represent. To me, yes, of course we can try legislative change. Yes, of course we can try different approaches to how the streamers should compensate us for what they get from us. But overwhelmingly, we have to work together, act in solidarity, and be much, much more aggressive and much more demanding and assertive about how important we are and how we should be paid for that importance. Sorry for the rant.
No, but I have something for you to challenge maybe a little bit more. You said the co-productions, you know, this notion of co-productions and Euro puddings as a problematic thing, and like to challenge this cultural diversity thing. Don't you think that maybe my personal opinion is that co-production is this great institution of European cinema, but it needs new thinking around it. You know, maybe there is a path to reinvent co-productions in a way that wouldn't be so connected to territories and languages, but it would be more pan-European. You know, to have this, maybe to rethink that if some fund or some country is investing, that it's not necessary to have something from that country in the film if the film doesn't need that. So to find a path, what do you think of finding a path to reinvent co-production as a European institution that would not force cinema and audiovisual production into some square, or but to push it to go outside?
I think that's a good question for Ada, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, maybe Ada could. Yeah.
Because I saw you wanted to react on a couple of things, and I
would like to react on first of all on a it might be a nuance, but actually it is absolutely true that we have huge access to content, but I'm not that sure that the visibility is there. Because yes, anyone has access to a Romanian or Slovenian film on Netflix that is sold all over. Who is gonna find it in the huge pool of content that is there? So that's why I think that that bringing energies and capacities together on subjects and products that are interesting for different territories, because I'm not telling to do, I'm not pleading for Euro codings. I think that the best films of this year, for instance, they are really very, very national in a way, very located, but most of them, if you look from Titan to compartment number 6 to Bad Luck Banging, they are co-productions, but they still are very local, very national. I mean, they are bringing to the world a story that it's coming from that place where they are taking place. So I'm talking about the intelligent, creative European co-productions, especially on the, how to say, on the cultural products that we are delivering. So we let aside a little bit of the products that are more made for entertainment, and that I do believe that are more national. But for small countries, it's almost impossible to deliver something that is powerful, that is relevant, also in terms of production value, that is just national, because we don't have the resources. That's a difference. I mean, countries, small countries like ours, it's not the same thing from for France or Germany or Spain. It's a different story. But for a lot of small countries, even rich countries in Europe, the Nordics are working together, even though they are rich and they have resources, but they work together and they cover the full Nordic territories. And that's how they finally broke through even in towards the majors and towards the United States, somehow together. So solidarity, indeed, I think it's a thing, and creative way of collaboration, not formal ways of collaboration, is the other thing. So that's my take on this.
Thanks, Ada. I'm sorry, I'm hijacking this a little bit, Klemen. It's your round. Sorry, David, you wanted to comment?
A small response. I mean, of course I agree with everything that you said, Ada. That's entirely true. But and this, I understand this is especially difficult for small countries. Coming from a small country where this has been a debate in our film and television industry for all of my life, I understand the problems of that one as well. But it does not necessarily automatically follow that a product made in any member state of the European Union, or in any cultural entity in the European Union, in a region of Germany, or in Flanders, or in Walloon, in Belgium, or whatever, it does not necessarily follow that it has to appeal outside its own marketplace. If it can financially stand up or survive, then there's no overwhelming reason why a German feature film or a German series has to appeal beyond its own German audience. If it can wash its face with its own audience, then why does it necessarily have to cross borders? I think we become over fixated on that. The vast majority of what's actually produced in Europe appeals to a local audience, and appeals successfully to a local audience. And I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing in itself. And I think that's one of the things that we should hold in mind about this. If we become, as I think a lot of people in the European Commission are focused on trying to create this idea that everything must cross borders, that if it doesn't cross a border, it's a failure somehow, is not correct. Now, of course, that comes back to Klemen's point about how do you finance feature film in particular in small countries. we know what the answer to that is. It has to be financed by the state, as indeed it already largely is. It has to be financed by the taxpayer, as indeed it already largely is. Feature films made in Europe on those tiny budgets and the extreme difficulties that we're in competition with the American majors, cannot survive without state support. Collaborative funding across borders would be a fantastic thing, as distinct from co-productions where everybody has to have their percentage in proportion to what they put in. I agree with that. But you know, co-production is essential. It's particularly important and difficult in small countries, but it's not the be all and end all. It's not the answer to all problems.
No, definitely. I completely agree. I mean, when you need a co-production, or yeah, you can call it collaboration. Probably it should be redefined, the whole concept of how to work together. I think that the co-production, it's fantastic when you really need it for an organic reason, and the co-production, it's a nightmare when you do it just for the sake of the formal ticking the box. Yeah, here we are absolutely on the same page.
Yeah. So if we did a little detour with a co-production, but if we return to the discussion about authors' rights versus investment in the sector, maybe Cécile, would you maybe talk about a little bit about authors' rights and collective framework, and how directives that were set in motion in last period, how are they providing solutions for authors, especially for directors, screenwriters, music composers, and also maybe performers who are also part of these actors?
Yes, Klemen, thank you. I think the four of us, Pauline, David, Marc, we worked very hard during the last few years to help some legislative text, European directives, to make a difference for audiovisual authors. And for me, today, there are immediate response that can be used at national level to improve the position of audiovisual authors and strengthen their authors' rights. So we have the Audiovisual Media Services Directive. It's not obvious at first sight to say that this is something that can help audiovisual authors, but because the main provision of the Audiovisual Media Services Directive is the quota of 30% of audiovisual works and the possibility for member states to implement investment obligation in local production to all operators, including the one who are established in foreign countries, but targeting their market. But even in this context, and even if now the implementation process is reaching the end, but I can take the example of France, who have had a very creative implementation of this in favor of authors. In a country where you would say, well, they don't need more than what they have. But for example, they have put as a condition for audiovisual authors to be qualified for European works to be qualified for the quota, that the production contract should respect the moral rights and the proportionate remuneration of audiovisual authors. So through this condition, they are trying to protect the position of audiovisual authors and ensure that their right to proportional remuneration is not challenged. or even strengthened. Then, of course, we have the two copyright directives, the directive on copyright in the digital single market first, which is for us, I would say, a very important piece of legislation that needs to be implemented in a good way, and that can answer a lot of the problems audiovisual authors are facing. There is the chapter on improving the contractual position of audiovisual authors, of authors and performers in general. My focus is very much on Article 18 on right to appropriate and proportionate remuneration, which is established as a general principle. So I'm not going to make the history of the negotiation of the directive, but this provision can be used as a legal basis for many things to improve the situation of authors. And we, as the ECSA, we are pushing very much our members to work in favor of establishing in every member state remuneration mechanism for audiovisual authors that would ensure that users of their works pay remuneration through collective management organization. And the crucial effect of this would be to cover streamers, of course, and all modes of exploitation of the audiovisual works. But there is also the retransmission directive. We call it SATCAP 2 directive in our jargon, which expand a bit the notion of retransmission and provide already this mandatory collective management system, so that every operator who is doing retransmission has to pay the audiovisual authors. So these are legal tools that really need to be taken by the professional organizations and, of course, the lawmakers at national level. And I know it's not easy everywhere. The dialogue is not necessarily very good with the authorities, but that's the tools that are there and we really need to go through this process and assess the situation and the result before we will be able to go back to the European level and say, look, these are the result of this text. It didn't, or it did provide this and that. We have to go further, but we cannot do that now. It's really important that action is taken at national level for that. So for me, these are really tools that have to be used at national level, and also thought with the new picture of the production and distribution of audiovisual works, and include the streamers in this. So this is not going to overcome the fragmentation of the market because I'm talking about national process. But for me, this is also a big challenge that we need to address. So maybe this is the second phase, I would say. But yeah, the market is too fragmented for audiovisual authors. You all know, when you are working in a country, there is some rules and remuneration you can expect, and as soon as you travel outside of your country, it's getting complicated. So when the rights are collectively managed, you can, via reciprocal agreements, collective management organization, exchange rights, and you can be represented, but as long as the society already intervene in the same field. So that's a really complex net of a relationship that is not harmonized yet. So this is something that also need to be improved for audiovisual authors to be really taking advantage of the European market. And last word, maybe on the recovery plans that member states are putting in place. You probably know that they all receive a lot of money from the European Commission to help them overcome the COVID crisis. And here again, there are opportunities from a financial perspective to invest in more generally in culture and audiovisual sector, and improving the situation of authors that can be tried at national level. And I will stop for here, but I think for now, I think there are a number of issues that we can discuss.
No, but you make a good point, Cécile. I'm sorry, I'm chipping in, Klemen. I'm just going to steal the floor from you. There are a couple of things that you said which are pretty critical. I think I have my own opinion about this sort of wave of European money, which none of us has the time to really think about how to get. So I guess that won't really be for us in the end. But you were talking about how we can really have a strategic thinking about how to make the different transposition of European directives work as well as they can for authors in this sector. And I think the link between the Audiovisual Media Service Directive and the Copyright Directive is pretty critical there. So what you're describing as our French colleagues have set up, or the French legislator at least has set up, is quite interesting. To go back to Marc and the music sector, or at least the music part of our sector, how you also work, we all work together in this copyright directive. And by the way, I completely agree with Cécile. Let's not reopen this thing too early, because I don't think any of us can survive a second round coming too quickly. So let's take a breath and try and work with this. How will you work with this? How are you working with this? And are you finding solutions in the transposition process for your members?
Yes, so thank you, Pauline. Just jumping on on what Cécile said, for us there is also a very interesting provision that was implementing Article 18 into French law, which is about screen composers, and basically it prevents, you know, any contracts that would prevent music authors in France to benefit from the French laws. So basically, it has the effect of a judge could basically cancel any buyout contract, for example. And for us, it's quite an interesting and good solution. We'll see, of course, how it will evolve. It's still quite recent, but for us, it's quite a good solution. And I think from a political point of view, it's also a solution that shows that European law applies really in Europe, because what is happening for screen composers on buyout contracts is that very often you have work made for hire clauses that are coming from the US, and that are basically, you have composers working in Europe, but facing a US law, with only the disadvantages of the US law without any benefits. So for us, it's a very interesting solution. On what you said before about the state support, of course, we agree, but we also think that policymakers should have a look at how streaming works. And for us, of course, the discussion about VOD streaming is very important, but we are also very much engaged into the issues related to music streaming. On this, the UK has been very active recently, and I think it's important to look at all the discretionary choices that have been made in building the streaming ecosystem, and which are often, you know, not very justified. For example, in music, you have one stream counted only after 30 seconds of listening. Why is that? Why 30 seconds? You know, and then it leads to some songs that are of a duration of 31 seconds, just to fill in, you know, the streaming count. And there is also the interesting discussion about market-centric streaming approach and user-centric. So basically today, in music streaming services, you have a total number of streams according to which you will, you know, provide the revenues to the right holders, which means, and you don't have a user-centric system, where basically you would have a link between really what you are listening to and the remuneration. And we think it's an interesting discussion to look at what is happening on the music side and the visual side, because I think it's time really for policymakers to look at all those choices, which are very important for the whole streaming value chain, of course. Otherwise, of course, for us on the AVMS directive, we very much support the promotion of European works. It's something that we would like to see also from the music side. And I think it's going to be, it could be one initiative that could be proposed in the years to come. But I agree, let's not ask for another copyright directive too soon.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a bit of mercy from the European legislator that we need on this front at the moment. I think you mentioned two things that are absolutely critical, and one thing which is probably the next topic for us to go through. You mentioned this notion that we can avoid work for hire by anchoring the contracts in a jurisdiction that recognizes authors' rights. I think for maybe directors and screenwriters, that solution is not exactly sufficient, because we do have contracts that are already localized in European jurisdiction, even if there are a couple of cases where you might think about that as a solution, but maybe it's less of a structural issue for our communities.
I have a thought here, maybe, Pauline, because it was mentioned in few thinkings that the highest standard of protecting copyright and of authors be connected to the public funding or the state structures of funding. This connection is also connected to the idea of how collective bargaining for our sector works. Also, the standards that industry sets for everybody to obey or to follow. This is in this region. And one other thing which I recognize is in this when Marc and Cécile were talking, that European the ideas that were brought forward through the directives and were as a guidelines to local government, to the regional governments or local governments, are not necessarily going through, at the moment. What is our strategy to when the dates already came, but the deadlines came, but there is not much there is not in many countries it is not finalized yet. And what do we do, or what should guilds and organizations, as European federations, can do to go and get the most, or revise the transpositions that were not sufficiently implemented?
David, I see you're ready to go.
I think David has a lot to say about this.
I think that's really the key question for us collectively at the moment. And I agree with Cécile that we are going through the steps of the implementation of the directives at the moment. The copyright directive has now been transposed in, I think, 9 countries, with drafts in 4 more. So we have still some way to go with the transposition of the copyright directive into national law in each of the 27 member states. And while there are extremely positive elements to the French transposition, and the German transposition seems to be very good, it seems to me that there's a tendency in many of the other countries to do essentially cut and paste transposition of the directive, with not much by way of additional elements being introduced into the law, as they were in France, to make the implementation effective. how are we going, if the Article 9 of the Copyright Directive is transposed into the national law of 27 member states, and producers and broadcasters are required to provide annual information to our members, what are we going to do when they don't provide that information? How are we going to persuade them to provide information that they don't want to at the moment, that some of them will refuse to, like the streamers? I think that what's absolutely key here is our collective capacity to negotiate aggressively. We have to push into collective bargaining in a much more aggressive way than we have done before. And I think one of the things that we have to do, and forgive me, Ada, one of the things that we have to do is to turn to our producer colleagues and say to our producer colleagues, if you want our help in protecting your intellectual property, in defending you in the next period of time, then you are going to have to reciprocate by being right with us in your relationships with us. You're going to have to commit to this transparency. If as producers you want transparency from the streamers, you're going to accept that you're going to have to accept that you have a responsibility to be transparent with your authors. And this is going to be a difficult debate over the next period of time, and it will come down to our collective strength and collective bargaining. And our two organizations have worked together on trying to increase our capacity to collective bargaining, and that is something that we should continue to do. Klemen, I think it's absolutely right that we should be approaching not just state funding agencies, but also public service broadcasters, to say to them that they too have responsibilities here, and that there should be introduced through contractual means, not necessarily legislative means, limitations on what people who refuse to cooperate in this system are able to get from the system. And the system now requires transparency. If you're not prepared to be transparent, then you shouldn't get the benefits of the system. And this should be something that we should push for, not just with the funding agencies, but also with public service broadcasting. Will we make progress with that? I don't know. But I come back to my rant. Our members are important people, and they should be treated better than they are being treated at the moment. This is going to involve us in difficult negotiations with the producers over the next period of time. I hope they'll be on side for that.
So I can't agree more with you, David, on this one. And as a matter of fact, I'm part of the working group for the implementation of the copyright directive in Romania, and I'm defending the rights of the authors, because once again, we don't exist without the creators. So they can't work without us, but we don't exist without them. This is crystal clear. So we are on the same boat, and we are independent. We want our freedom of creation, and we want to be paid for it, all of us. And of course, we should be transparent. There is no question on that. I don't know how in other places it's happening, but in my company, these things are very clear and open.
And there is a common ground between producers and authors in this question about getting better visibility on the exploitation of the works that you produce and that we create, particularly online. Because as you were saying earlier, we are facing very challenging times in terms of understanding where the works are going, how they're meeting the audience. We're seeing Netflix, for example, changing its metrics for audience, for the audience, the number of viewers, and that challenges also the way we can value our rights, particularly when they're exploited on these platforms. How do you have a sense of how collectively we could approach this issue with the streamers? Is that something that you've been thinking about? But for example, in your working group on the transposition of the copyright directive, or is that further away?
It's complicated. It's still very, 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 very hard to get the public bodies understand the need of this kind of exchange, the strength that we have in this kind of capacity that David was mentioning. I mean, sometimes it's really weird when you look at the authority, at the politicians and public bodies, that the moment that they hear a name of a big streamer, they are like this and they obey, and hey, it's our national content. It's our national people, it's our artists that you are claiming, that you are sustaining, and you will have a statue when this guy will be dead, of course, not while he's living, that made this step or this step, that went to the Oscars, that's sold in certain territories, that this and that, you are praising them. But the moment that someone that has economical power is coming, you obey and you forget about the rights. And
well, if I was to play the devil's advocate, and I'm a local government, and this is COVID-19 times, so I don't have tons of public money to distribute anymore, and I'm thinking, you know what, if this global streamer comes in, produces in our territory, makes our people work, I mean, if this sort of makes me less liable to invest in this sector with public money, why not? You know, our people will work. Why bother? I mean, and then it's up to us to make the point about the fact that if you do this, then you're exposed to any and all business strategy changes from these global players who can take up everything they consent to invest locally and go away in a minute, no matter how the investment obligation is structured. And so I find it really hard sometimes, the discussion you described, to find in front of you exactly this sort of mindset, a sort of short-sighted industrial logic, which has more to do with can I balance my accounts than that it has to do with a sort of long-term vision, both industrial and cultural, for your country.
You are absolutely right. The only thing is that Romania is not Poland, and basically they are not investing. They are very rarely, very scattered presence in terms of what production services are made in Romania, due to many elements, including the blocking of the cash rebate, but I'm not getting into that in Romania. But fact is that they are not that present, so they are not investing. So it's
not even like I'm getting rid of something that I had to do.
They are providing us. They are giving us access. They are so generous that they give us access. And how can we tax them? How can we ask them to pay?
I'm so sorry, Klemen. I have a super funny story very quickly. So there is an MEP in the European Parliament who asked a question to the European Commission recently, asking them why it was that a certain global streamer was not received in every single European country, and why it was that the European Commission was not doing anything about it. Because, you know, that is how you access audiovisual content, which we love. Do you see the craziness that we face today when MEPs who are basically usually defenders of cultural diversity are finding that in requesting access to a global streaming platform more than saying, why are these platforms not showing European works? That was my little funny story from Brussels, and people know who they are. Klemen, sorry.
I just wanted to do the intervention in a way that what Ada was saying, the only way to do it is like it was done in France, to make 25% of investment obligation. So it's that it becomes so demanding that as we saw when I was having a panel on the AV conference in Ljubljana during the presidency, the Slovenian presidency, I talked to Amazon and they openly said that they are thinking about moving out of the French territory, completely moving out of French territory, because it's more than the investment obligation is bigger than the budget for whole Europe that they are getting from their mother, from from across the Atlantic. So they would rather go to smaller markets where there are less obligations and leave France totally. And so you understand what I mean?
So
because the obligation is too heavy for them. But if the obligations would be in all countries 25%, they wouldn't be able to move anywhere else.
So we have to navigate this very tiny space between the goodwill of these operators, which are bringing cash to the market, and the understanding of policymakers and people with the ability to change laws to somebody's benefit, and to make sure that they see our sector as culturally and artistically important as well. It's a very narrow path, isn't it? Maybe, I mean, maybe it's time for us to go for a final round of wrap-up comments. We've touched to so many things. Thank you so much for being very open and candid in the conversation. I don't know how you want to wrap up. Maybe last thoughts, David?
Maybe what to do in the future. What is our short and long-term tactics and strategies? Okay. There's three items that we missed as we were talking through that I just wanted to refer to that we should add on to the discussion. One seems like a relatively small one, but it's increasingly important for us. And that's unpaid work, is the volume of work that authors do for which they're not paid. Spec scripts, preparatory work, planning work, et cetera, for which they're not paid. And distribution, promotion of the work. Yeah, and we definitely want to bring this onto our agenda in the context of more emphasis on the whole area of development in the coming period. And another thing that I think is important to mention is the very widespread attacks on public service broadcasting that are happening across the European Union at the moment in different countries for different reasons. But all of them, I think, very negative from our perspective in the long term. And I think that support for and defense of public service broadcasting, the principle of public service broadcasting, is something that we should have on our agenda. And another one, having tried to emphasize over and over again that the majority of production in Europe is not global, is in fact local and national. Nonetheless, I think that we have to put a lot of time and effort into thinking how we respond to the global companies. And I know that this is rather simplistic and rather trite, but if they're global companies, there needs to be a global response. And from FSE's perspective, we are trying to build better and closer relationships with our Korean colleagues, with Israeli colleagues, and most importantly, with the American colleagues. If we're to have a global response over the next period of time, from our perspective, it would be because we do global campaigns to respond to these global companies. And then finally, both short-term and long-term, close cooperation between FSE and FERA has been, I think, beneficial for both of us, and I hope will continue. And in particular around the issue of collective bargaining, with producers' organizations, with public service broadcasters, with private broadcasters, and hopefully also with the streamers, I think is key to taking the legislative changes that have happened at European level, that are now happening at national level. And we have the responsibility for trying to ensure that, having been put into the national law, they are then applied effectively in the industries in which we work. And that's our responsibility as collective bargainers over the next period of time. Yeah, great.
Thanks, David.
Yeah, Pauline, yeah, did you want to say something? It was Cécile. Yeah, you can go.
Thank you. Well, just as a conclusion on my side, I think the future is really with collaboration. I feel a bit like, I mean, I've been in this field of European association in the creative side for quite long, and sometimes I feel like Sisyphe. I have to read you every 5 years or even more, explain again how important audiovisual authors are, and what is needed to protect them and improve their position. I think David is right. We really need to work a lot on highlighting how important screenwriters and directors are for the society, for the economy, and for the future of Europe. This is something that is also needed with the local authorities, public authorities. So, and we see that very much now in the process of the implementation of the directives. Many lawmakers at national level, they just want to implement the directive with the minimum effort. So to copy paste the provision, only do what they have to do by law, and they are not taking naturally all the opportunities that are offered by those texts. So it's only if our organization members are really pushing and offering them a solution or a path to improve their position that they will take it. It might change in the future because the Commission wants to do more regulation than directive, but for now, I think we are quite interesting tools at European level that took a lot of efforts, but you really need to translate that at national level. And that's the big challenge we have today, but the potential is really there. So any support that we can do as far as the SA is concerned, we are trying to help our local members to push for better remuneration mechanism for audiovisual authors. But it's really a challenge in many countries, and probably the smaller the country is, the more difficult it is, because the knowledge, the capacity, the skills of the lawmakers are not there to understand our sector. So raising awareness on our sector is really something we have to do all the time. Yeah, I think that's the immediate future that need to be sized for improving the situation.
Thank you, Cécile. Marc, your vision for what is at hand to do?
Hey, thanks, Klemen. So I agree with what David and Cécile just said. There is a need, of course, for more transparency. There are provisions in the copyright directive, but they need to be applied, across the whole value chain. It would be really important. There is a need for streaming. There is a need for more studies and a role for policymakers really to look at how it functions. It can't be only an issue between private stakeholders under non-disclosure agreement. That's something clear for us. On the copyright directive, also to mention that there is a problem with the interplay between competition law and the copyright directive. We are trying to push for the Commission to solve this issue at the moment. It's very important, because otherwise the copyright directive would not be able to fulfill its real promises. So it's something we are looking at. And then just jumping on previous comments that were made, for us, indeed, it's really unacceptable that public broadcasters, public funds are used, and if this is often the case in Europe, are used for against a fair remuneration of authors. We've seen the case in Sweden, sometime in France, but using public funds and basically to use mechanisms that are like work made for hire in the US, it's something unacceptable. If you use public money and European funds, you should respect the tradition of European authors' rights.
Thank you, Marc. To conclude, what's your vision for the future? Like, what's at hand to do?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, and the way I'm seeing the things, is that we need more advocacy at the conjugate level towards the understanding our rights and why we are claiming them. And when I say our, I'm talking about the whole chain of creators of content in the audiovisual work. And as a conclusion for what happened today is that I want more. I would love to explore more, and there were very interesting ideas already and thoughts, food for thought that were given here, and I'm very, very grateful. And really, I would like to continue this collaboration and exchange of ideas, and would love to have the people from our bodies. We don't have really guilds. I mean, it's somehow it's a complicated situation. We don't have guilds, but somehow the collective rights organization for directors and screenwriters, it's working also as a kind of guild. So they are wearing both hats somehow, which is not necessarily good, but it's something, it's more than nothing. And I would really love to pick your brain sometimes, David. I would be really delighted, and Cécile, for our sessions with the Minister of Culture, that they hardly understand how important it's to implement the instruments that the European Union is giving, but to implement them as to be functional in the local context. And Marc, the musicians in Romania, they are fighters, but still I think that they have things to learn and things to exchange together. They are probably the most active ones, the most aggressive ones in the local context. And for the small countries, again, Slovenia's example would be very interesting for us, as much as I would extend this kind of regional discussion to see how our small countries, and especially Eastern European countries, are dealing with these issues, and what they managed so far in their original way, like what Poland managed and what Slovenia managed and what Czech Republic managed, and so on and so forth. And so thank you very, very much, Pauline, for this opportunity. It's been a pleasure.
I think the pleasure was all ours as well, isn't it, Klemen?
Yeah, thank you very much to all our panelists for great discussion. We covered a lot of ground. I think it's also food for thought for all of us, and there is a lot to discuss in the future. So this is one of the stations that we all together board on. So I'm really looking forward for us in the future to discuss more and find solutions for the benefit of authors, audiovisual authors, especially for film directors, screenwriters, composers, and performers who are also a big family that is also part of audiovisual creative industry. So thank you for your thoughts and your discussion. Pauline, last word?
Not really. I think that's it. Thank you so much for your time today, and looking forward to more at some point in the future. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.